Hey YouTube, you're about to watch a conversation around the use of Moxy Monitor inside CrossFit for all things monitoring, for all things conditioning. In this conversation with Sebastian, Daniel, and Assaf, we talk about the Moxy technology. I start with a little intro. It goes pretty fast, so if you want to take pauses and take some notes, that might be warranted if you are not familiar with the technology, but I kind of brush through it to have a foundation of understanding. And then we go into talking about the use of the technology in CrossFit, talk about conditioning, we talk about respiratory training as well, and coaching more broadly. I had a lot of fun recording this little exchange, and I look forward to doing more of those in the future. If you have any topics you'd like me to cover in those types of exchanges, please leave me a comment below. Without further ado, enjoy the exchange.
All right, cool, guys. So just to give a bit of context, you guys reached out and had questions about using Moxy in testing, and more specifically in CrossFit. So since I'm a bit, I wouldn't say rusty, but I took a few minutes to put some slides together, and I guess for both of you guys, but although you know already how this stuff works, I think for the people watching, it might be interesting to have a foundation if they've never kind of used the tool. I'm going to go through the slides pretty quickly because I don't want to take the whole time to do that. I definitely want to talk as much as possible, but that way you guys have a reference point. Please stop me if something's not clear. Assaf, if you disagree with something that I say, please stop me as well. I like it when people disagree, so please go ahead. So if it's cool with you guys, I'll share my screen and we'll get cracking. Okay, here we go. Assaf, you'll probably remember a few of the slides from my Moxy intervention last year. So basic Moxy 101, it's a NIRS sensor that we apply on the skin, and that's going to shine a light into the tissues. And essentially, depending on whether the hemoglobin, myoglobin, so the oxygen transporters are bound or not to oxygen, it's going to refract light differently. So we can say it's going to have a different color. And this is what the Moxy measures. And so essentially we have that SMO2 value, which is the balance of oxygen delivery and utilization. There's a second data point that we get from the Moxy, which is THB, total hemoglobin. The last year and a half, maybe even 2 years, I have not looked at THB. After talking to both Roger, the founder, and Andrew Feldman, who's done a lot of development with the Moxy, both these guys said that THB was not as reliable as what they first thought. So far, I really haven't used it much. If we just talk basic physiology, you guys are familiar with exercise intensity domains. So the analogy I like to use is the 4 states of matter. So you have solid, liquid, gas, and then plasma. And we kind of have the same on the intensity spectrum. We have the moderate domain below the first threshold, however we want to measure that. Heavy domain between the 2 thresholds, severe domain above. And then anything kind of short of 2 minutes is going to be in the extreme domain. And we're going to have a different response from the body internally to those different intensity domains. What I've done the most is used a protocol that I've called Protocol 41, for no better reason that is 4 minutes of work and 1 minute of rest. And that was adapted over time. Assaf, you guys use 5-1 or 5-1-5 still? With cyclists, I believe?
Yes, we use the 5-1.
5-1, okay. So initially the 5-1-5 is something that I found in the Moxy community. I then switched to 5-1 simply because once I added other measurements, lactate, VO2, ventilation, I didn't need the repeat stages anymore. And that way, instead of having bigger jumps, I could have smaller jumps between the different steps. And I shortened it eventually to 4-1, simply for a matter of time, because I work with mostly CrossFitters, and durability is not their strong suit usually. And anything over an hour is going to start to dig into resources, sugars, and stuff like that. And I don't want to start playing with intra-testing nutrition like they might do in cycling and stuff like that. So just to keep it short and simple, 4 minutes on, 1 minute off. And I calibrate the test to get about 10 steps. So that's about 50 minutes of work total. At first, I was very confused because we used to see different profiles emerge from that intensity spectrum, from very easy to very hard, say 1 out of 10 all the way to 10 out of 10. And eventually GEM solved that little mystery From what we understand, or from what I understand so far, skin fold thickness has a big influence on the Moxy signal, and essentially how deep the Moxy signal penetrates kind of changes the way that the response comes out. What I mean by that is there seems to be a difference in oxygen kinetics in the more superficial layers of muscle tissue and the deeper muscle tissue. So if you have somebody very lean, say a male CrossFitter, for example, and you put the Moxy on their quad, you can assume that the light is going to go a little bit deeper in the muscle than somebody with a bit more adipose tissue between the sensor and the skin, or between the sensor and the muscle. And so those kind of two general trends emerge. If I'm not mistaken, Jem calls them linear and parabolic. So the linear is kind of a flat down flat, and the parabolic is parabolic was more of an up flat down. And we can equate that to the intensity domains: moderate, heavy, and severe. I'll come back to that just after. If we think of oxygen utilization, it keeps going up linearly as power increases, right? So if you add 10 watts, 10 watts, 10 watts, 10 watts, VO2 is going to go up, 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 up. And if you pull a line, it's almost a straight line. The way I like to visualize it is that oxygen delivery in red goes up until the second threshold. And it seems like threshold 2, critical power, whatever we want to call it, is kind of the maximum oxygen delivery that the body can express. And beyond that, we keep using more and more oxygen, but we can't deliver anymore. So we've kind of reached that maximum delivery, and we have that decoupling that happens, which we'll talk about just in a second in the form of W prime in the critical power model. But essentially, it's important to understand that kind of things go well up to that second threshold, and then above that, things go sideways. One element that got me to understand that is this reference about the physiological determinants of critical power. The highest one that we see here is capillary contacts around type 1 fibers. And so the way I understand that is capillary is the interface between the blood and the muscle. So the more capillaries you have, the more oxygen you can pass from the blood to the muscle, and then maintain a kind of a balance inside the tissue. And the way that we can see that on the Moxy is for somebody who's lean with the more linear profile that I mentioned before, is that above critical power, we're going to have kind of a minimum flat line at the bottom. It's rarely zero. And we have to remember that absolute values are not as important as the trend of the line itself during a sustained effort, but we see that kind of flat line at the bottom. Quick refresher on critical power. Critical power model has two parameters: critical power, which is the intensity above which we can no longer maintain an internal homeostasis, or kind of an equilibrium at the metabolic level. And the W prime is it's almost like a battery. It's almost like a savings account, which you're only going to tap into once you go above your withdrawal limit on the checking account. So critical power is checking account. W prime is a savings account, and that savings account has a finite amount that is stored inside of it. And to take a very simple analogy, a sprinter is going to have a very big savings account, a very big W prime, and a more kind of an ultra trail profile or ultra endurance profile will have a very small W prime. And that's just to do with the demands of their event, some anatomical, physiological factors. But essentially, we have those two components. The importance of understanding the difference here is, can you guys see, or are your heads blocking the graph?
No, I can see it.
All right. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that you can have, I think it was 300 and I can't see my own information. Give me a sec. All right. So those two profiles have the same time to task failure at 395 watts, which is 6 minutes. But one of them has, let's say, a lower critical power and a much higher W prime. The other one has a much higher critical power and a much lower W prime. So they can express the same performance on 6 minutes, but they get there in very different ways. And it's important to understand the difference between these profiles, because if you were to prescribe 325 watts, the blue line here, to those two profiles, well, one of them is already in their severe domain, one of them is still in the heavy domain. And so I think it's one thing we can probably get from the Moxy that I'll get to in just a minute. moving on. Yeah, that's a really interesting, some really interesting data that I collected on myself on a 3 and a 12-minute test when I was doing some critical power testing on myself. So what you see in in green and orange are the left and right quad on the 3-minute test. The blue and red are the left and right quad on the 12-minute test. So you can see that obviously at 3 and 12 minute, I'm in the severe domain. So I'm going to go above that second threshold, and right away I'm going to go to that minimum, and I'm going to stay there the whole time. What's really interesting is that light blue and then the yellow lines, which are the bicep. So bicep is a non-involved muscle in cycling. That was on a bike, by the way. And what's interesting is the slope of that SMO2 on the bicep. And it's not because I was progressively holding the handlebars harder and harder. It's that once you go over that second threshold, you start to eat into the W prime. And it seems that Moxy is able to kind of illustrate that fact at the physiological level. So critical power W prime is a mathematical model that we apply to performance based on output, whereas SMO2 is going to be an internal measurement. And it seems like those two overlap quite nicely in that regard. And we can imagine, so 3-minute, the line goes down really fast. 12-minute, the line goes down less fast. And we can extrapolate that and imagine a zero slope, which would be that critical power. And that's something that Kirby and all studied quite extensively in the last few years. They use that for the Breaking 2 project with Kipchoge and his colleagues. So that's definitely something to dig into for those who are interested. I think that might come in handy in CrossFit. We can talk about it again after. So W prime being that kind of decoupling between delivery and utilization in the severe domain. And so when you have a Moxy on a non-involved muscle, it's kind of the W prime, obviously only in the severe domain because it doesn't exist below the second threshold. And then Moxy on the quads would be the balance between delivery and utilization. Quick snapshot at a session that I did on the bike recently. So easy, sustain, easy, hard, easy, sustain, easy. And so you have the lactate measurements here show quite nicely how things change over time. And where I'm trying to get to with this is that the SMO2 kind of follows a similar trend where we have flat in the green, we have a slight downslope in the yellow, we have that reactive hyperemia, we have the baseline or the minimum in the severe domain, and then down again. And then if we omit that little bump because of the prior higher intensity, we have another flat line. And now if we condense all that together, we can see we have that linear profile that we talked about before, where we have a kind of a flat down flat trend. That's one of the 4-1 or protocol 41 tests that I've done. And two things that are interesting here is, again, the change in trend. And the reason why I don't use exclusively Moxy and I do use lactate as well is because Moxy makes a lot more sense when you have a lactate curve to begin with, because you have a reference point, and then Moxy allows me to be more precise with my interpretation of the profile or of the lactate. As you can see here at the 200 watt mark, which is the fourth stage, you have a little break, you have a little kink, and then it obviously changes trend moving forward. And that's, again, something that we can kind of visualize like this and see the differences between those intensity domains. A couple more training related slides. That's 16 times 400 meters that we did recently with a CrossFitter. We did a little training camp with Claudia, who's a French CrossFitter. This was the quad, and we see less variation than on the other ones, but we definitely see a couple inflection points. This is the forearm. So again, interesting to see the non-evolved muscles. And for reference, when I test on a bike, I'll do vastus lateralis left and right, and then a bicep. And then on runners, I'll do rec fem left, right, and then the forearm. That's what was used by Kirby, and you get some good measurements there. So that's what I use.
Why do you use the forearm? Just to get in uninvolved muscle, or
uninvolved muscle. I probably could use the bicep just as well.
Okay.
But that's what Kirby
Okay.
did, and I figured I'll just follow suit. This is the hamstring, and what's interesting is the trend of the hamstring on the SMO2. If I just overlay it with the paces that she was running, it matches quite nicely. So you can see that once she started accelerating, it starts going down. Then there's another flat line when she's around that 440, 450, and then she pushes on the last two, and there's another dip in the curve. So it superimposes quite nicely with the pace and with the RPE as well. The lactate, she was pretty stable the whole time because it was sub LT2. But it's nice to see kind of the data correspond between the pace and the SMO2. Two profiles of runners that I've tested, and what's interesting here, here and here. What's interesting there is seeing the differences in profiles between two runners that are have let's say somewhat of a different typology. You can see more of a, if I may say, type 1, and I don't have muscle biopsies to back that up, but I have a more kind of endurance type 1 athlete at the top, and you can see a higher overall trend in the SMO2, and he maintains a higher level as well in the heavy domain, and you can see that then when he passes into the severe domain, it drops really fast, whereas with another runner who's more of a 400-800 specialist, and if I may say, more of a type 2 kind of athlete, we see a lower trend overall, and we see slightly lower levels, and conversely to the other profile, a gentler slope in the severe domain, up to task failure on the test. And here we were doing 4 on, 1 off up until threshold 2, and then we just did a 1 minute ramp, kind of a hybrid step ramp kind of test. And then to finish, then we can talk. The main Moxy mistakes that I see, or I would be aware of, would be one, using THB and interpreting that too far. I definitely think there can be something to THB if we had a proper THB, because again, talking to Roger and Andrew, it doesn't seem like total hemoglobin is actually it's not a quantity measurement, right? So it's kind of hard to use it. And another thing that we have to consider when we think about blood flow measurements is that we have 3 factors that are going to influence that. We're going to have metabolic vasodilation, so the body responding to the need for oxygen and kind of opening up the blood vessels to bring more oxygen. So that's one. Then we have the sympathetic vasoconstriction, so the nervous system trying to regulate blood flow and limit blood flow so that we don't run out of blood to supply our brain and all the muscles. And the third factor is muscle compression, because muscles contract and they apply pressure on the vessels. So that's one of the reasons why I leave THB aside, because we can parse out those different things. At least I can't, and I don't have the tools to do it. So that's one of the reasons I leave it aside. So that would be one. Second error would be comparing device to device that are placed on different muscle groups, because again, we can't control for adipose tissue thickness, even if we do a skin fold measurement. Like Assaf, were you on that study with Jem, the one I showed before?
Yes.
Okay, so you know it better than me. And even if you have a skin fold measurement, you still can't control to the millimeter how deep the signal goes. And even moving the sensor a little bit on the quad might yield a different measurement. So we can't compare between devices. We definitely can't compare between people. And we also shouldn't spend too much time looking at absolute numbers unless we're in a situation where we can use the Moxy day in and day out, like the Norwegians do, and then you can get to know, okay, what are my numbers, and what are my numbers at sea level, what are my numbers at altitude, what I want to get back to once I get to the end of my altitude camp. But unless you use it every single day, it would be hard to use absolute values, in my opinion. And the last one, I think that was it. I think that was my the few mistakes that I would try to avoid. So here you go. That's all I have.
Wow,
Very cool.
that was excellent.
I It was fast. It was 15 minutes. I'd planned a bit more, but I thought, let's get to it. And then you guys can ask your questions. It'll be more fun like that because I don't want to present for an hour.
That was pretty intense.
Yeah, you can go back and watch it again.
Yeah, Basti, do you have any questions maybe before we move forward? I'm sure it's your head's a bit spinning on its axis right now, but maybe we can help with that a little bit.
Can you go back to the oxygen utilization curve that you've shown really early on in the talk?
This one? Sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. Which one was it? Was it
well, where you introduced the W prime?
Oh yeah. Let me just find that. Is it this one?
Yeah, this one. So, like, just to get it right, the oxygen utilization increases linearly.
Linearly, yeah.
Yeah, linearly. Way up to zone 5. So at which point I thought like at whatever VO2 max, it's like there is the maximum oxygen utilization, then you're tapping into other systems and the utilization is not increasing anymore. Is this incorrect?
I would say that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Assaf.
That is correct. That is correct. But VO2 measurements are looking at not only utilization, but also delivery.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah. But utilization, essentially, this is a snapshot that's coming from what a muscle would normally do. And so a muscle, you want to think about it like, without insulting anybody, it's kind of a dumb a system where, once it requires oxygen, it just takes it. And once oxygen is present, it will take it. So that's why that blue line is linear, but you're limited by the delivery.
Okay,
that's why.
Okay. So essentially, the utilization curve kind of mimics the delivery curve in the sense that at the max point, the utilization is just lower because the delivery is not increasing anymore.
Yeah, and another thing, because you mentioned that VO2 max idea, anytime, essentially, well, theoretically, anytime you are in the severe domain, you're going to reach VO2 peak or VO2 max. So you could be, 10, 15 watts above threshold 2, you could be 100 watts above. You're going to get there just at a different pace. So if you're way above, you're going to eat into the W prime way faster and then express your VO2 peak much sooner. So there is no definite point where VO2 max happens. It's in the severe domain. Now, where exactly? Well, it depends how long you stay, what you did before, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, cool. Talking about the W prime. So the W prime essentially is, because I think your analogy was pretty good. You say it's
a savings account.
Yeah, the savings account. Is it like when you reach that point? Like, well, I just want to clarify. It's like basically when you tap into the anaerobic system and you're utilizing glycogen more. Is that correct in this regard as well?
You're using glycogen right from the start of the activity. So even in
but on a very low or lower level,
much lower level. And then you have I don't know if I could say it's linear, but it's a pretty steady increase in sugar utilization all the way through the intensity spectrum. And so the anaerobic side is definitely present right from the beginning. So you don't switch. It's not like you pass from one to the other.
Yeah.
It's just that maybe we could say that and Assaf, tell me if you would agree with that statement. We could say that the oxidative system above the second threshold can no longer cope with the global metabolic load. So you're not able to recycle stuff fast enough, because in order to recycle stuff, you need the oxygen. And again, if we've reached our maximum oxygen delivery level, which is second threshold, well, we can no longer give more, but we need more because we keep using more and more. That's kind of how I would conceptualize it.
Yep.
So we're generally reaching like the fat max oxidation, and that from that point on, if we have fat max, the glycogen system is taking more and more over because there's the oxygen delivery is limited.
Yeah.
I would say, we want to always think about it in relative terms. So the relative contribution of glycogen is going to increase relative to your production that's coming from other sources, such as your oxidative phosphorylation, stuff like that.
Okay, very interesting.
I was just trying to find one of was it metabolic? There was a really good illustration of where is it? Do you remember the name of the paper, Assaf? It's one from Samalan, and he has the metabolic flexibility. I think that's the one. Yeah.
But they're excellent papers. Okay.
Yeah. So here you can see fat oxidation with the white squares, and then you can see lactate with the black squares. And is there one with carbohydrate oxidation? So you can see here, carbohydrate oxidation is almost a straight line. So it starts low and it just keeps creeping up and up and up and up. And there's different reasons why, fat oxidation goes down after a certain point. But essentially, you have at low intensity, you're going to be using the highest proportion of fat on the intensity spectrum. It's not that you're using only fats. It's not that you're using more than sugars. It's just this is where you use the most fats, period. But sugar is always in the picture as well.
Okay,
that makes sense.
Another question about about that whatever you want to call it, deflection point. But theoretically, if we could deliver more oxygen, would the cell be able to use that? Would it be really able to use that oxygen? So we are kind of limited by oxygen delivery. That's what you're saying. But in essence, if we could deliver more oxygen to the cell, it would be able to use that oxygen. So there's the limiting factor is not the cell not being able to use the oxygen, but really the issue is that the delivery is not working that well enough at higher levels, or it's stopping at higher levels. So it has a rate limiter.
In a healthy individual, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because obviously if you have some issues, some kind of disease from the maybe even some metabolic conditions that will impair oxygen utilization. I saw I think it was just an N of one, forget his name, a guy on Twitter that I follow, and he has a oxygen chamber accessible, and he did a lactate test in normoxia, hypoxia, so lower oxygen concentration in the air, and then hyperoxia, where he had more oxygen than in the normal environment, and his lactate curve was pushed to the right in the hyperoxia, so saying that he had better performance with more oxygen available, because obviously the whole game is a gradient between the outside air and then our cell, and then it's just about how much pressure of oxygen is here and how much pressure of oxygen is down here, and it's kind of the steeper the slope, the more you're going to be able to kind of push into the cell. So the higher oxygen level in the hyperoxia condition allowed him to drive more oxygen into the cells and just have a better performance overall, which was pretty interesting.
That's very interesting. I don't I've been doing quite a bit of breathwork training as well, and there's this concept of oxygen disassociation or CO2, whatever you want to look at, but it's one of the issues with the delivery. I guess the blood that's reaching the muscle, it's still oxygenated enough to actually that it would be able to disassociate from the hemoglobin, but has it to do with I'm sure it has to do with the gradients of whatever the CO2 level is and the oxygen level is. Have you guys played around with breathwork stuff in that regard, having higher CO2 levels in the blood and allowing better disassociation from oxygen into the muscle?
Assaf, do you have anything? I have, but I'd be interested to know.
I haven't done a lot of breath work in my studies, but next week we're going to have a meeting on that or this week, actually tomorrow we're going to have a meeting on that, so I can give you some updates.
I'm really well connected with Lars Lienhardt. Maybe you know him. He's a German sports scientist, and I think he's kind of the main guy in Europe for doing neuroathletic training, and he's working with Alexander Zverev, for example, and with a lot of really great German runners and basically through the field. And just recently has been teaming up with people that are very much into breath work and stuff like that. So that's why I was curious to see. That graph is great. Yeah.
So what you were saying, I would agree with it, where if you can hypoventilate, so breathe less air than you would normally at a given intensity, you will retain more CO2 and you will affect the O2 dissociation curve. And I've seen that in the Moxy data and the VO2 master data. So I wore the VO2 master and the Moxy, and I maintained a constant output. And in the first condition, I breathed normally, and then I slowed down my breathing and reduced essentially the liters I breathed every minute, to the point where I had a need to breathe, but I was kind of forcing myself to breathe a bit less. And just like you said, what you could see is that the Moxy goes up a bit. So it goes down a bit, because you're actually using more of the oxygen that's available in the capillaries, and you could see it in the fraction of expired oxygen on the VO2 master as well. When you do that, what you see is that you have a lower FeO2. So essentially, out of the 21% that you breathe in, you're going to exhale most of it. Breathing normally, you're going to exhale about 17%. And if you force yourself to hypoventilate, I've gone down to 13-14%.
Wow, okay.
And then you need a lot of work to be able to sustain that, right? Then there's also I think there's two sides to that coin, where yes, you can influence oxygen, you can influence the oxygen availability, let's say, in the dissociation, but you also have to consider that then your internal systemic load from an acidosis standpoint is going to be a little bit higher, and I don't know to what extent that has a direct impact on performance, or maybe it's a matter of how long are you doing that for. But obviously there's no free lunch, right? So
sure.
CO2 and you're trying to push much higher intensities, that it might get trickier up there. But what do you think, Assaf?
I just think that from the point of breath work, it's, the question is potentially not so much if it does anything, but rather how much. Right. So to me, it was always a question of, if I want to add more training to my athletes, let it be stretching, or let it be breath work and stuff like that. The question is, how big is the value? And that's not to say that there isn't any, right? So what I will say is there is one key element that Sean, you and I can have a discussion on that some other time, but it is related to muscle contraction. And one of the things that I think needs to be added in conjunction with NIRS, in research at least, is measurements of muscle recruitment and EMG, or electromyography, which essentially tells us how many times the muscle contracts, at what force is it contracting, and that is a very important piece of the puzzle that is, in many cases, at least until now, hasn't been used at the same time. And the reason I say that, even if we look at ventilation, it could be that the relative contribution of breathing less relative to the signal that we're seeing with Moxy at the limbs could come from the fact that when we breathe less, we're contracting the respiratory muscles less as well. So there could be less steel coming from those muscles, which again, they're not, their relative contribution perhaps isn't as great as the lower limbs, but that could have potentially an effect on what we're seeing here with being able to shift the curve to the right or to the left. So again, it's a question. Yeah. So
no, I think what you're saying is super interesting. There's Timothy Noakes, and he kind of proposed a central governor theory, and at least I think it's a little bit like an old school model, but I think the newer models are pretty interesting. And I think what's fascinating to me is that at one point, or at some point, the brain says, hey, we have an issue with too high CO2 levels. We need to ventilate more, or we need to breathe a little more. So I think what's interesting to me is that actually the inspiratory muscles or expiratory muscles, when you breathe heavily, are actually consuming quite a lot of energy compared to resting state. And I'm not sure about that in total, but I think it was up to almost 20% of the total energy is coming from the respiratory, or the respiratory muscles need about around 20% of all the energy being consumed in a state. And as you're saying, if you are able to reach that threshold a little later where you have that urge to breathe more, maybe you could also like reduce the impact of all those muscles quite considerably, like your scalenes and all the auxiliary breathing muscles, and that might be the reason that you see a change in the parameters. So that's fascinating to me as well. Thanks.
That could definitely be the case. Not ruling it out. It's just really a question of first of all, are you getting a benefit for respiratory training from other types of training? Mm-hmm. What is the contribution of specific respiratory training on, let's say, if I wouldn't do that, but I would run and cycle and all that. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, where does the metabolic shift happens? Mm-hmm. Is it happening because I breathe less? In theory, yes, of course. But if I do it, if I decide to breathe less, will that change because of the metabolic changes, or will it change because of me breathing less, contracting less, and that's causing the metabolic change? So that's just to me, that's always been the question. But along the same lines of understanding muscle recruitment, as we talk about a more complex movement, such as in CrossFit, I think that's really where the question comes about. Like, can we actually utilize something like Moxy that would inform us about how a specific muscle is functioning? Could that be of utility? And I think for a case like CrossFit, now that you know what the shape of the curve looks like, I think it will be very interesting to see, can we use this stuff in cross training to inform us about what each muscle looks like and whether or not we can improve the shape of the curve by, again, doing specific exercises and really construct somebody's training program based on those profiles for each specific muscle. So that's kind of where I would go with that.
Okay, super interesting. Because I think like there have been a couple of studies from just recently, because I did a lot of like breathwork stuff, and there was a study in the European Journal of Sports Science from 2018, and they put people, they induced voluntary hyperventilation, and they saw like a really good increase in running repeated sprint ability in rugby players, and then they did some other inspiratory muscle training, and they also saw in soccer players, and in professional soccer players, they saw a pretty good increase in the repeated sprint ability. And it would be interesting to figure out what exactly is driving that change, as you're saying, is like what's actually happening physiologically. That's like, what is breathwork doing and what is it changing? Physiologically.
If I can chime in on that, I think that we have to be conscious that breath work is a big basket, and that it includes different types of work, because just let's call it technical breathing or just
I know there's so many terms out there.
So there's the breathing optimally in terms of recruiting your diaphragm properly and then using all the intercostals. Then there's the more the CO2 stuff, and then there's Wim Hof and the hypoxic stuff. Or hypoxemia stuff, and then there's the respiratory training where you would train. And I mean, I would say that this falls in the same basket as training, because you train your muscles, and when you train your diaphragm and your intercostals, they get thicker, they get stronger, they get more metabolically robust. And what you were saying before, you were on point, and I pulled up a slide that I have here. The blue is the legs, and that's in the severe domain, and that's another parameter we have to be conscious of, is that the respiratory muscles, unless somebody's really limited by their respiratory system, the respiratory muscles are not going to kind of kick in fully until you're beyond that second threshold. Because again, you go above that steady, that metabolic steady state. And now you have very fast accumulation of hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, stuff like that. That's going to generate more CO2 through the bicarbonate buffer system. Now you have a lot more CO2 coming in from the metabolic and non-metabolic pathways, and then you have to get that out. So your respiratory system is all over the place. And yes, when you're up there, it's up to 15 to 20% of the VO2 that is used by the respiratory muscles. So I think that it's pretty obvious to state that if you train the respiratory muscles, they're going to become more efficient, they're going to be stronger, more endurant, and as such, you're going to see increased performances. I see Daniel has a question. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, it's really interesting discussion. I was just curious, since we're talking lots about breathing and oxygen utilization. I'm curious, Sean, you talked a little bit about work prime and functional reserve capacity being relevant to CrossFit athletes. I'm also curious what you think about the first LT1 and relevance for CrossFit training. So once you can pinpoint it, what's the application? We had some discussions around, if we want to regulate intensity to ensure volume without undue fatigue is met, that might be one application. But then it gets into this problem of, in the cycling world, we just have the bike, and the economy is based off of that one movement. And so we don't need to worry about generalization. But then when we get to CrossFit, it's you're on the rowing erg, then you're on the assault bike, then you're doing the cycling lifts. So I'm just wondering how you get prescriptions for these different zones when you're moving across movements, whether you have to isolate each one and so on.
I think it would be a fool's errand to try to test every single modality and movement and then try to plan on that basis. I think that's probably pushing it too far. And so I've essentially, kind of drawn my arbitrary line in the sand. And at the beginning, I was trying to think of a CrossFit specific protocol. But since CrossFit is technically undefined when it comes to the testing, you can't really do that. So what I did, and obviously you can, standardize testing, and a lot of programs do it now where you have certain tests throughout the year on certain things. But I went all the way back to what's the most basic test we can do to assess somebody's functioning, under the hood kind of thing. And it's the bike for the lower body, and it's an arm crank or a grinder for the upper body. And those things are not common in gyms, let alone CrossFit gyms yet. But I wouldn't be surprised in coming years if that would, be more popular. And one of the reasons I think that is that the bike is just a good illustration of how developed you are from a metabolic standpoint, period. And there's no technical aspect to it. There's no necessarily muscle contraction limiting from a max force output standpoint. So it's just a good broad general test to assess somebody's fitness. And if we think of CrossFit as nutrition, metabolic conditioning, and that's obviously the pyramid of the philosophy, not necessarily the sport. But I would still argue that CrossFit being such a volume demanding and intensive sport in terms of training and competing, if you don't have a good base development, you're going to be limited in some capacity, whether it's you can't recover, fast enough between your sets of squats, between your 3 sessions in a day, between your days of training, between your weeks of training. When you're in a competition, you're doing 3 WODs a day for 3 to 4 days. How fast do you recover between those? And I think that's back to the fundamental metabolism and base, essentially. So what I pull up here is the aggregate of the data I've collected on CrossFitters on the bike on my 401 protocol so far. You see the men in green and the women in red. And you can see the average CrossFitter has, and they're all competitive CrossFitter, obviously at different levels. And you could see that the average CrossFitter has a first threshold at 140 watts. Which is fairly low if you compare it even to an amateur teen cycling. And obviously it's easy to compare it to people that do only one sport, but it's still pretty low for people who train 10, 15, 20 hours a week. And what I've seen by pushing that to the right is that you can just do so much more work and you can just recover so much faster. because you're pushing back that point where things become difficult, it just essentially makes your life much, much easier and enables you to train much harder. And to Daniel's question before, that would be my argument for that very basic testing on the bike for a CrossFitter. It's non-specific, and that's why it's interesting, because it's not specific. It's a general conditioning test. And the better your conditioning, the better you'll do at high volume training, period. Then obviously you need the right programming to get the stuff out of it, to get the performance out of it. But I would say that a standardized bike on a standardized test on a bike, and ideally on an arm crank for upper body endurance and performance, might be a very good baseline to start with. And actually see, okay, such and such athlete, you have, threshold 1 is here, threshold 2 is here, your max on the test is here. How does that compare to the norm? And then if you're, competitive and you want to go far, we got to push that to the right. Otherwise, you're always going to be running behind the guys that have a threshold 1 above 200 watts, threshold 2 above 300 watts. So that would be my kind of perspective on the if I answered properly.
Thanks, Sean. Basti, I think you're on mute.
Oops. No, I'm unmuted. So this guy's aerobic threshold is at 140 watts.
Yeah, on the bike erg. That's all tested on the bike erg. And you could see that's threshold 2, so average at 223 for men and 150 for women. And again, the best guy is going way above 300. And I haven't tested the best of the best. It's I haven't tested.
But these are professional CrossFitters.
No, they're not professional. They're competitive CrossFitters.
Oh, competitive. Okay.
Yeah. Professional CrossFitters will usually be, I'd say between 160 and 260 at threshold 1 for men. Okay. Which is again a big spread. And I think that's probably, in my opinion, one of the areas that's still fairly untapped in competitive CrossFit is you don't see such a massive spread between the best of the best in their their strength numbers and the weightlifting numbers, but the disparity in the conditioning side. I've tested some of the guys that are top 20 in France, and there's a massive difference between even that elite population. And I think it's a gap that is fairly easy to fill, right? Because it's not hard work. It's just time.
But would you think that you could draw meaningful training conclusions for them? Now we have this test, but like what other tests can we do to see if somebody is really having a detrimental testing that leads us to guiding his training a little bit more? So what you're saying, or I think what Ivan was saying as well, is so all the stuff in CrossFit that we do is so super short. So basically, everything below or at the aerobic threshold or lower than the aerobic threshold, like classic zone 2 training, stuff like that, is probably not the most useful for CrossFit. I did a lot of zone 2 training with good CrossFitters, and I saw that they were significantly improving in their performance. But my question kind of like, there were all these people from the, I would say, like long endurance world that say, hey, zone 2, you need to do more zone 2, and the best is you train whatever. If you train 15 hours, 8 hours should be, or more than 8 hours should be zone 2. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I see the benefit for doing CrossFit, but do you actually see also in longer duration domains, do you see it, let's say at 1 hour mark, do you see a significant difference in all these athletes that you mentioned when you test the top 20? And would you say that like some of them really have a lack of some capacity in their aerobic system that shows why they're weaker?
Yeah.
You get my question?
I do. So CrossFit lives in the severe domain, right? Say 3 to 20 minute time frame. It's in the severe domain. It's really kind of right there, bang in the middle. That being said, and yes, zone 2 is not specific to CrossFit when it comes to competition time. However, we can't just say, well, all you have to do to be good at a sport is do the sport, right? Soccer players don't play 5 games a week to get better. Marathon runners don't run marathons every day. So I think what we have to think about in the case of that low intensity work and not so low as well, I think the zone 2, 3, and 4 are 100% underrated for just general development. And no, you shouldn't do that, with crazy volumes all year round. But think of what Matt used to do, in his preseason. He would spend 6 months between September and February doing no CrossFit. He would do no CrossFit. And that 1 year where he got to the Open and he won the Open, and he said, I shouldn't have been, fit there, because obviously he wants to be fit for the games, not in February. But he still won. And all he was doing is monostructural work, strength work, gymnastics work. And then he put it all together. And then he did 5 months of specific, and then he destroyed the whole field from multiple years in a row. But going back to your question, I think that, yes, most CrossFitters are deficient in the kind of the moderate and heavy domain development. And I've seen that the most in people that do one of my programs, which is essentially just a very basic, some zone 2, and then also some tempo and some threshold work. And those are the kinds of things that are never really worked in CrossFit, because a solid tempo session is minimum an hour and a half. They get up to 3 times 20 minutes at 85% of their second threshold, and with rest in between with the warm-up. So that's at least an hour and a half. Who's doing an hour and a half continuous on either a bike or running? Or I've seen such massive changes in people through that kind of work. One of the main reasons being is that what you develop in zone 2, 3, and 4 is the infrastructure that helps you then express your fitness in zone 5. So you have to think that zone 5 is the high intensity. You're gonna, produce a lot of lactate, a lot of hydrogen ions, a lot of metabolic byproducts. And if you have more infrastructure to recycle that stuff, you're gonna be able to hold it for longer and go even harder. So that's kind of where I would put it. And yes, zone 2 is important, and I would probably say that 3 and 4 are just as important for CrossFitters, because they don't spend enough time there. And that's just a matter of, the sport is the sport, and before it was a philosophy, and then it morphed into a sport, and then people forgot to fill in the base once they took out the GPP out of their training, and now it's all specific all the time, and people get, unfortunately go too far in that. But you know what I'm talking about.
But I think what's super interesting in your argument is, and I trained the best Austrian CrossFit athlete over the till the games 2023, and I did a lot of zone 2 work, zone 3, zone 4 work with her, and it was the first time that she went actually to regionals at that time. So that was interesting to see for me. And but going back to what Assaf as well said is, for example, I also did a lot of breath work with her, and I think very often if you work with these CrossFit athletes, they want to do more, and they just want to. The best thing, or that they believe, or a lot of them believe, that the best thing was to just do 4 to 6 watts every day, which is, in my point of view, really stupid training. It's not developing any kind of meaningful capacity anywhere. It's just repetitively hitting the same specific stimulus or unspecific stimulus. And what I'm often trying to do is trying to get them away from doing more, let's say, unnecessary work, and include stuff that is not taxing their system so much, in a sense, hey, I do breath work with them because that's what they can add to their training without taxing their system too much.
100%.
And that's one of the things I'll try to do is, so hey, what can we, how can we actually make you better without doing super intense training? Because most athletes, they think more intensity and more volume is the only thing that brings them forward. And I think it's a big misconception in our world. But so you would still say that fairly, let's say, unspecific zone 2 work, zone 3 and zone 4 work is highly beneficial for most people in the CrossFit community, or in the CrossFit sports. Just
like non-specific strength work is beneficial, right? I think I would put it on the same level. It's their general physiological qualities that will benefit everything, right? We forgot in the last 10 years, seemingly we forgot that general transfers into specific, and it doesn't have to be specific to have a positive impact. And obviously in highly specialized sports, like cycling, for example, you can't just say, well, go train your arms more and that's going to help your cycling, because obviously in edge cases it doesn't work. But for a sport that's so as broad as CrossFit, I think general qualities that will help anything that you do, period. And that's where it's interesting to do that pretty basic work.
So guys, just to follow up, sorry, Basti, but so I guess what I'm getting at is what you proposed makes sense, Sean. It's like, you know, a baseline test and a validation to see how the training's progressing. But what I'm wondering is, are you ever getting to the point of zone targeting through NIRS? So like, you know, for example, you saw someone's zone is 140 on the bike, but then when you send them out for a run or you put them on the rowing erg, you have this transfer problem. And it's kind of like, do we just go to soft measures like talk test and RPE and that sort of thing? Or are you really like targeting maybe through daily use of NIRS to see like whether they're actually keeping in the prescribed zones?
That's a good question. I do think that Moxy can be a very valuable tool on the field to assess intensity of the sessions. But as you saw, unless you as an athlete have time to collect data every day and then look at the data, I think that the data processing and analysis is what is most deficient right now in the NIRS space, because it's messy, as you saw before, right? It goes up, it goes down. If you have a bump on the road, it's going to change. So you can definitely use Moxy just like you would use lactate on the field, and then check or spot check or with a Moxy wear it the whole time and have those measurements. But I would probably argue that, you know, you might be better off having a baseline test and running and in cycling, and then basing your those trainings off of those. And then most people in rowing and skiing, they honestly just need to work on their technique more. I've seen such big gains in performance on those machines with zero intense work, just by building the base on the bike and then applying better technique on the machines. So yes, you could technically use the Moxy for intensity modulation in different types of sessions. Where it becomes hard with CrossFit when you get out of the monostructural is the changing demands, changing blood flow, and that makes it infinitely complex to look at a Moxy in session. I think you could, just thinking about it like that, you could probably play with some, you know, sub threshold 2 work, some more extensive kind of EMOMs or stuff like that, using a non-involved muscles and doing maybe 4 or 5 different exercises on your lower body and having your Moxy on your bicep, and you know you're going for an hour because it's going to be some 6 or 7 out of 5 type of work. And then Moxy would tell you if you start to go above and too far and you have to, you know, pull it back just a little bit, that would be an application. Although I would argue that if, you know, the athlete is doing an hour of tempo CrossFit work, they're probably to the point where they can feel when they go beyond that second threshold, or at least they should be able to feel. So as much as I love all the data and everything that we've talked about so far, I think another aspect that is underdeveloped, and that's true in all sports, not only CrossFit, is RPE. It's just rating of perceived exertion and how hard people are working, because, you know, enough gold medals have been won with a time watch and nothing else. You don't necessarily need all the data. If you can really listen to yourself and monitor your athlete properly, you can do a lot with very little. So obviously blending technology and perception, and that's something I think the Norwegians did really well in triathlon, where they used the tools to sharpen their perception and know that, okay, this is what I'm feeling now and this is what it looks like under the hood. I think that's a very smart way of maybe educating athletes. So to answer directly, Daniel, on the monostructural work, yes, the Moxy could be interesting for intensity control. On the multimodal stuff, I would probably say that you maybe could use it to educate athletes and show them that, hey, this is not what we're looking for. But I mean, you could do the same with a lactate meter. You could show them that, hey, we're trying to do this, but you're actually doing that. And it's not bad. It's just not what we're trying to do with that session. It's like, oh, we're trying to do 70%, you know, speed and technical work in weightlifting. And then all of a sudden they put 95% on the bar. It's not wrong. It's just not the right time to do that. So yeah, I would say monostructural education, maybe the multimodal, but then you would have to be smart about what exercise you prescribe, where you put the Moxy, what you're trying to get from it. So the multimodal aspect definitely makes it a lot more complicated to use directly, like you would use, you know, any other tool.
So you basically do you guys use a normal bike, or why don't you use an air bike?
I use the bike erg because the multiple reasons. The fan on the bike isn't very doesn't work well with the VO2 Master because the air is just pushing up into the mask. So that would be a logistical limitation. And I also think that one thing you're going to see on a full body bike like an Echo and an assault bike is a very high kind of emphasis put on the cardiac output aspects, because there's so much muscle mass to bring oxygen to. And what I like about the bike without the arms is that you can just isolate the legs, which are going to be the biggest muscle groups. And I've heard enough people in CrossFit now tell me that following the program, their gymnastic endurance got better because their legs could recycle stuff better. That obviously there's a transfer there as well. And yes, could they do endurance on their upper body? Yes, and they probably should if they're very deficient there, or at least it's probably one avenue to develop, strength endurance in the upper body. But yeah, I would say that the bike is the most basic and the simplest to test. I'm also partial to the Concept 2 machines just because the PM5 is so good and it allows you to be quite precise with the work that you do, whereas the other bikes, the calibration is always a big question.
Yeah, agreed. Okay. Yeah, I think the calibration is the main issue. It's so hard to use it properly. Okay, that's so.
Hey guys, I gotta jump off at some point, but I will, it's so interesting to hear your guys' thoughts. I actually love the fact that we took it to a coaching angle, which in my opinion is much more interesting than the physiology, but, but I will say, I think that the educational piece is huge. And this is going into coaching philosophy in many cases. And CrossFit is relatively new compared to other sports. And I think that the thing that is spearheading a lot of sports, not just CrossFit, is the pursuit of intensity and the pursuit of, linking between how hard am I working versus how many gates I'm going to get. Where in reality, I don't remember who told me this, so I'm going to avoid any references, but this is not me making up, this is somebody else saying. That you can't pull intensity up. You can only push it from the bottom. And what that means is you got to work on your fundamentals. If we don't have a broad enough foundation, i.e. if our aerobic conditioning is poor, it doesn't matter how hard we can work at a given, how hard we can push. If we can't repeat that and we can't do it over a long period of time, and CrossFit, it is long periods of time because they have to train and they have to do competitions day in, day out. Then you can't, you just can't build, you can't improve the athlete. And so I think that having the test, let it be the 5141, any type of aerobic fundamental test, is very important. And just to see the figure, Sean, that you posted about, that you showed us, seeing how CrossFit athletes perform on the bike, that was really surprising. Right? It was
you mean that they were so bad?
Yes. Yeah. They were almost at a point of somebody just jumping on a bike that hasn't done any form of training.
Like an amateur, yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't do any type of training, not just CrossFit, but nothing. That's pretty much the same values. And so I think that the value here is really moving in the direction of trying to educate people about having to spend time doing the aerobic conditioning and prioritizing not only the volume, low intensity training, but also recovery. To me, I would always put recovery up top, always. It doesn't matter how hard you can train. It's a matter of how much time you have to recover from that training. And for us as coaches, we have always dealt with that, right? Our athletes, if they are very motivated, very keen on their training, they're going to blow themselves up if we're not there to hold them back. And I think that's really where this element of testing really made a difference for me in my practice, where I can show somebody, if they come to me after months and years of training really, really hard, and you see that their aerobic conditioning is relatively low, like we saw in that picture, that you just come and you show it to them in real time using the Moxy. You just show them, look, your engine is running at very high RPMs, but it's a tiny engine. And what you want is a big engine that is, not revving its nuts off every time they look at the weight or see the track. So I think I can see the complexity. Trust me, I can see the complexity of selling that mindset to an athlete and telling them, listen, you actually need to train at a lower intensity, and no pain, no gain. It's a very hard sell. But I think the beauty of Moxy, at least for me, the biggest change is the visual aspect. And the fact that the person is sitting on the bike, they do a test that isn't very hard, no matter what sport they come from. And you just show them, look, this is why you should think about the way that you're training. And you're not going to be, not doing the specific work. Specificity is the key difference between doing different types of sports. You're still going to do CrossFit training, but you're just going to do it in a way that is, quote unquote, more efficient. And that's pretty much it.
Assaf,
Now,
are you working?
Yeah.
Are you working with CrossFit athletes as well, or mainly with CrossFit athletes, or
I haven't
totally
worked with
through the
CrossFit athletes, but I've worked with hundreds of athletes,
Okay.
not all of which were cyclists. And, even in cycling, you got pure sprinters who I think, unless you're doing something very, very, very specific, and you're of a certain phenotype that really should preferentiate more high intensity work. I can't even really think about a person like that, because overall, as humans, we are aerobic animals. That's who we are. So even if you're the purest of weightlifters, ever existed, and you're a physiological anomaly, you're still not going to be as anaerobic as some other animals in nature. We're just not built like that. So the foundation, that aerobic foundation, once it's highlighted through a test like that in a nice visual manner with a NIRS sensor, they're very likely going to be walking in the wrong direction. So I'll leave you guys with that. I love this discussion, and I wish I could stay longer, and I would love to have another one down the line.
Likewise, yeah.
And more of these discussions are, in my opinion, very much needed still. And yeah, especially going into other domains.
Thanks for jumping in, man.
Thanks for your time.
And Assaf, let's connect. And we're overdue for a podcast, so I have to have you on, and then we can talk about physiology as well.
100%. I know, 100%. So, Sean, but thank you so much for all the work you've been doing. It's been very helpful for me personally as a NIRS guy. I'm sure many others as well. Thanks for educating the audience and for letting them know that the work that we do exists. And yeah, Daniel and Bastian, Sebastian Basti, right?
Basti,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we'll be in touch for sure, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts following this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Assaf. See you, man.
See you soon.
Guys, I have probably another 5-10 minutes, and
cool.
And then I'm gonna have to jump off as well. So if you want to go over some more.
Yeah. So one of my, let's get more specific. So how much work? Okay, so you test somebody. What you generally see with most athletes, CrossFit athletes, you'll see a very low aerobic threshold, I guess, if they haven't done specific work on the endurance work, aerobic work. How much of their training do you guide in a way that you say, hey, we're going to focus a little bit more on specific energy system development? Could you give any kind of number? Like, hey, okay, we have 12 hours of training, 15 hours of training. How much time do you allocate? I guess it's very dependent on the season. So that's what I do as well. It's like, hey, when we have off season, we do quite a bit of energy system development.
Yeah.
How much time do you spend there? Essentially?
I think we have to, instead of asking for a kind of an arbitrary number, we have to think about what they've done so far in that realm, right? So if somebody's never done any strength training, you don't start with 5 because the best do 5, right? And I mean, I know you know that, but I think it's important to take the person that you have in front of you as the reference point. And so in that case, if they've done 0 low intensity work their whole life leading up to that moment, but they train 10, 15 hours a week or more, just start with 2 or 3 because that's where you start. I always take that quote from my friend Kier Wenham-Flatt, who says, if you use advanced means of training, and by that it could be a type of exercise, it could be volume, because that's also a progression parameter. If you use it too early, you rob the athlete twice. You rob them from the linear adaptations they could get from simple means of training now, and you rob them from the good stuff that they could have gotten later on from that advanced work.
Oh, yeah.
So there's no point giving 10 hours to somebody who's never done 3 hours a week consistently in their life. So 3 hours, and then you push it to 4, 5, 6 in the off season, and then you go back to 2 or 3, and then the following off season you go back up maybe to 4, 5, 6, 7, and then you go back to 5. It's a year-to-year progression at that point, because like Assaf said, we're aerobic animals, and it's a quality that we still haven't tapped into fully. And people that have pushed to the extreme can tell you, I mean, the Norwegians are limited by calorie intake now. It's not about training.
Yeah.
It's just how much can you eat to supply the training, right? And I think you could virtually do so much more. It's just like we said, intensity control has to be part of the picture when you're trying to do more and more. But yeah, so I would start at 2 or 3 hours a week, and people could even start at the start. I used to say, well, 1 hour minimum, because below that it's useless. Honestly, somebody who comes to me and who's never done that in their life, I'm going to tell them, do
30 minutes,
do
whatever,
20 to 30 minutes,
yeah,
3 times a week, and then try to do an hour once a week. Continuous, because duration, I think, is another parameter that we have to consider strongly in that development or in that regard. But yeah, it could be, 3 times 30 or 3 times 20 plus 1 hour. And that's an hour, that's 2 hours total in the week. I would start with that. And then I would wait for them to say, okay, I feel good, I feel better. Let's do a bit more, and then progress that over time. And like I said, really use the frame of general phases and specific phases, and then maybe do more in the general phases and less in the specific phases, because obviously there's got to be a trade-off in the total volume allocation. But that way you can have more of an up and down picture throughout the year, where people think, oh, well, I can't do 3 hours or 5 hours every week all year round. Well, you probably shouldn't, unless, depending on your level, you might, but and your needs. And again, if somebody's super deficient, I would probably say that they need to emphasize that more overall. Somebody who's already really well developed, like I have Alex, somebody that I tested 1.5 years ago for the first time, and then he followed my training plans for a whole year back to back. He did some mostly low and medium intensity stuff, some high intensity as well. I'm not allergic to intensity, and all of it on the bike. And now he's at a point where threshold 1 is at 225 and threshold 2 is in the 325s. He doesn't, I would argue that he doesn't necessarily need to go any higher, because the hours that are going to be required to push him higher than that, is that the best bang for his buck to push his...
They're diminishing returns.
Diminishing returns. So at that point, now what we're working on is I'm working on a prototype to switch a bike erg into an arm crank. So you put it upright, take the back part off, and then you have some pedal adjustment and stuff, but essentially cycling with the upper body. And I think that is something that we will probably see appear a lot more in CrossFit in the coming years, especially for the elites that don't have a background in swimming or in gymnastics, because upper body endurance is obviously a big factor in the sport. And if you can push that with a very simple means of training, with no impact, with a very cyclical movement, I think you can get some really good stuff out of that.
Did Matt Fraser say it's a secret weapon? He had a bike crank, and I think in one of his talks that I saw, he said that that's his secret weapon that nobody else is doing for his upper body.
I'm not. Yeah, I saw that one too, and it's not surprising because if you can develop the lower body and it's going to help the upper, it's going to be the same the other way around. And obviously, CrossFitters are pretty muscular on the upper body side of things, so all that muscle, if you can have more capillaries, more mitochondria, better recycling capacity and better endurance, better durability, it's only going to make your training better. And again, I always say for people that say, well, it's not specific to my sport, I don't want to do zone 2 because my sport is high intensity sport. It's you have to think about it as a 2 degrees of separation. It's not necessarily that zone 2 makes you better at CrossFit. Zone 2 allows you to train more, to recover better, and that allows you to get better at CrossFit. That's kind of how I like to put it.
But do you think just from No, go ahead.
Sorry, Basti. Yeah, just because last question for me, but basically, can we split this into 2 streams? Because I mean, the importance, like, we've all been talking about how zone 2 allows for volume increase, and that's really critical because people need to train at high volumes for CrossFit as well. If you're on the bike or another endurance machine and you're really targeting aerobic endurance and the increase of like a steady power output with phosphorylated oxidation, that's like, it's energy system targeted work. Then on the other hand, though, you have like regulated intensity when you're doing a WOD, say, right? And that's a skills acquisition session that's done at low intensity for the purpose of accumulating volume. So I'm just wondering, for that second session type, is it a lot softer in terms of like, we just want to take a lot of weight off, we want to slow things down, keep it more casual? Or are you thinking like we can actually have some kind of heart rate zones, we can maybe implement NIRS, like there's more refinement we can do when we're working at those low intensity for skills acquisition in CrossFit?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I would not use heart rate because every time you change modality, your heart rate, quote unquote, zones, if we can even apply those zones to non-cyclical elements, is going to change. So it's a fool's errand to try and regulate everything by heart rate when you're going from a thruster to handstand push-up. So I wouldn't use heart rate. Honestly, I think in that case, if we want to think of intensity regulation, not on the zone 2 monostructural stuff or even 3 or 4, but the multimodal stuff, I think lactate might be one of the best tools, because lactate, you have a systemic measurement. So you can see body wide, what is the global response. And obviously if you have, and we would have to take that for athletes that don't have any very apparent muscular limitations, muscle endurance, for example, on a handstand push-up, because if they're just going to blow up because they can't do the reps, then there's no point in including that. So it would have to be on, say, an EMOM or an AMRAP that's pretty long, where somebody can sustain quality repetition round after round after round with no issues. I think that might be an interesting place to use something like lactate, because you're going to be able to see, mid 5, 10, 15, 20, or even every 10 minutes, do a standard kind of session with that and see where they are and see, okay, we were trying to stay, sub LT2 because that's the extensive work that we need to do. But here we saw that in the last 2, your lactate is jumping up. So you're obviously just going too hard, or you don't have the durability, and we know that thresholds are dynamic, and if you fatigue, they go down, right? And so at the end of the session, wherever that reference point is in terms of intensity might be different than it was at the beginning, which would be another argument for the longer, easier stuff, is to build that durability. But yeah, the multimodal, honestly, the Moxy might be interesting in a few years, or maybe for people that know more than me, and how you would be able to actually parse out some valuable information from repeat, efforts on different muscle groups, different movements. I just see it as being very complicated at the moment to draw any valuable, unless again you do an extensive session that's only lower body based, and then you put it on the upper body to make sure they don't go above that second threshold. But you can probably tell by their face anyway. You don't necessarily need the data to tell that they're going too hard relative to the 6 out of 10 that we're supposed to do. So maybe as a global perspective on that, and keep in mind, I don't I don't program and I don't train CrossFit athletes on the holistic level. I really just focus on conditioning and respiratory training. So I usually complement other athletes' training based on the global programming that they have, or kind of take over the conditioning and the respiratory part. But on a global scale, I think, again, RPE is a very good way to think about training and say, well, this week we want to do that 40-minute EMOM at a 5 out of 10 for 40 minutes. And next week it's going to be the same RPE, it's going to be 50 minutes. And then the following week, you're going to go up to 6 out of 10 and then 7 out of 10. And now you have a nice progression over a few weeks. That's also auto-regulated to the athlete's current status, because most people aren't going to spend the time to do the HRV in the morning and then fill out their questionnaire. And I think that's something that's coming and that's going to be used more and more. But if you don't have that, you can still say how you feel in the moment. And a 6 out of 10 today might be very different than a 6 out of 10 yesterday and tomorrow. So I think RPE is probably one of the best tools we can use to auto-regulate intensity, especially on the longer stuff. And again, also educate our athletes, because the knowing what you feel is going to make a tremendous difference in pacing afterwards. And that is very important for competition.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Basti, if you have a last question you want to finish with, I gotta take off. But
I have so many other questions, but
we'll have to do a follow-up.
You know what I always found really funny, and you mentioned it specifically, is how bad a lot of elite CrossFit athletes are at simple stuff like rowing. It blows my mind that I can
low-hanging fruit. Yeah,
that I can outrow somebody that is 20 kilos or 10, 15 kilos heavier than I am. Because he has such a shitty technique. Do you sometimes use the Moxy to show them that they're actually having a really crappy, that they're blowing apart their quads without producing any meaningful wattage on the rower? Do you stuff like that as well?
I haven't, but I would if people came to me for that. I definitely would use the Moxy as a tool to show, hey, you're not using your legs. It's all your erectors that are doing the work here, and you need to push and you need to wait and you need to pull after. And so I think, and most CrossFitters they're all very smart and they learn fast usually because of how many skills they have to acquire. So once you show them that rowing is just like weightlifting, and you have a first pull and you have a second pull and you have to wait with the arms, you can't bend your elbows too early, and you don't want to pull with your back, you want to keep a nice straight line between your hips and your shoulders, they get it really quick. And obviously then it does take time to implement the training, do it better, do it consistently. But I fully agree that on those I call them technical modalities. So they are monostructural, but honestly, man, just do technical work 2 or 3 times a week and you'll go so much farther than killing yourself on the rower and the ski.
And then I have another last question, okay?
Sure.
Really last question.
Sure.
If you train somebody on the bike, how much carryover do you see when they're not rowing specifically on the row when you would test them on the rower? Do you have any data on that? Like it always says like the endurance is modal specific, and when you're running it's different than biking, and when you're biking it's different when you're sitting on the rower and stuff like that. But do you actually do we have some data on how that really looks like? If we improve the physiology, let's call it that, like how much carryover do we see to
if performance numbers are data enough to show that and I have a case in mind, a guy who followed my extensive program, so the kind of low medium intensity stuff on the bike, and then he did another 2K on the rower, which he had done a few months prior, and he shaved off I think 12 seconds. And he said the feeling was worlds apart, and he did 0 training on the rower.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's really good.
Right. And I've got many and they're mostly anecdotal data where people come back and say, my running feels so much easier, my rowing feels so much easier, even though they didn't train specifically in those modalities. So I think, and that's why again I'm so kind of bullish about the bike. It's because these are general physiological adaptations that will carry over no matter what the other modality you're trying to perform in. So I think we have to come back to, hey, let's train the fundamentals, and all of those carry into the sport, no matter what this. And obviously, there's diminishing returns. And obviously, if you take Kipchoge and you put him 20 hours on the bike a week, he's probably not going to get faster on his marathon. But
for
outside of outside of that tail end of the distribution, there's a huge amount of transfer, and there's definitely low-hanging fruit, like you said. I think the breathing, I think the easier work, and again, it's not just zone 2, there's 3, 4, and that's not done enough. Probably very short sprints are underutilized as well.
I agree. Yeah, totally.
Wingate type stuff once in a while is a very potent stimulus. But I think all those are maybe overlooked a little bit, and should take a bit more time of people's training, at least in some parts of the year. Again, I'm not an absolutist in that regard. You have to plan your training intelligently throughout the year based on your goals and when you want to peak. But based on that, you have time to work on stuff that doesn't look like your sport, and you should.
Well, maybe we can have a second talk as well.
Yeah, for sure, man. Let's do it. That was fun. That was a lot of fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was great. I learned a lot.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, let's stay in touch by email, and let's do another one sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
You guys take care.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye.